Allow me to begin this exposition with a truth many still hesitate to accept. The human mind is neither a peaceful territory nor a harmonious structure where reason and consciousness govern with tranquility. On the contrary, my clinical experience has shown me that the human being is driven almost entirely by forces they do not know. The ordered surface of consciousness is nothing more than a thin veneer covering a turbulent ocean, full of contradictory currents and impulses tirelessly struggling for expression. What we call the self is merely what we manage to see, and yet we see very little. I have always believed that the psyche is, above all else, a battlefield, not in a mild metaphorical sense, but truly an arena where real, living, and insistent psychic forces confront each other daily. Every word we utter, every desire we conceal, every choice we believe to be rational is in fact permeated by silent conflicts. There is a constant tension between what we want to be and what we are, between what we desire and what we fear, between the freedom of fantasy and the shackles of morality. And it is this irreconcilable tension that defines the human psychological drama. When I observe a patient, I don't just see a person talking about their life. I see a consciousness trying to negotiate with its own ghosts. I see a mind attempting to impose order on impulses that surpass it in both strength and depth. Psychic life is not harmonious because the unconscious does not accept compromise, does not understand rules, and does not recognize limits. It insists, invades, distorts, remodels reality, and often consciousness is nothing more than an exhausted narrator trying to explain the inexplicable. I often say that what an individual considers most rational within themselves is, almost always, just the final justification for a battle already fought in the deepest layers of their mind. Conscious thought arrives late to the psychic process. It's like a diplomat who tries to interpret with dignity a treaty they did not participate in creating. This mismatch between what we feel and what we think inevitably creates suffering, but it also creates humanity. For we are divided beings, and it is precisely from this division that our capacity to desire, create, love, and unfortunately torture ourselves emerges. Over years of listening to dreams, memories, and confessions, I realized that every person carries a fundamental conflict within them: the desire for immediate gratification and the need for social survival. This conflict is as old as civilization itself, for culture demands that we renounce impulses that biologically have never ceased to exist. Thus, we live between two equally powerful forces: the internal hunger and the external discipline. It is in this permanent clash that character is formed, and it is in this friction that our deepest anxieties unfold. But do not mistake this conflict for a sign of weakness. On the contrary, it is proof of the complexity of mental life. An animal does not hesitate between impulse and duty, it follows its nature. The human being, however, knows their own division. We are witnesses to the clash between our most primitive part and our most elevated ambitions. And this division, although painful, is what allows us to grow, reflect, and transform the world. The human mind is an imperfect machine, but it is also an extraordinary laboratory where reason heroically attempts to tame the chaos. Therefore, I assert, no one is fully conscious of themselves. Consciousness is merely the lighthouse illuminating a small patch of the ocean, while the rest remains in darkness. And yet, we insist on believing we control our thoughts, feelings, and actions. My work has always been to dispel this illusion, not to diminish the human being, but to liberate them. For we can only act with true lucidity when we recognize that a large part of what we are is hidden, subterranean, pulsating, and attempting to emerge in unexpected ways. Thus, before explaining the psychic instances, the id, ego, and superego, I must invite you to grasp this fundamental principle. The human being is a territory of conflict, formed by layers that clash, blend, and contradict each other. There is no natural harmony in the mind, but rather a constant search for equilibrium. And it is precisely this search that makes every individual so fascinating, so fragile, and so profoundly human. By studying the psyche, we are not merely studying thoughts. We are studying silent battles, invisible decisions, and an entire universe that lives hidden within us. If we truly wish to comprehend what I call the id, we must begin by abandoning the illusion that the human being is governed by reason. Reason, as I often say, always arrives too late. The id, on the contrary, is punctual, insistent, and absolutely tireless. It is there before thought, before morality, before civilization. It is our oldest, most primitive, most spontaneous part, the one we inherited from times when survival depended on nothing but instinct. The id does not think, it demands, it does not negotiate, it pushes, and if it could speak, its voice would be permanent, strident, and childish. I want this now. It does not matter if it is possible, permissible, sensible, or disastrous. The id knows no such words. I like to compare it to a hungry animal that lives inside each of us, scratching, growling, and waiting for the slightest opening to escape. And the truth, however uncomfortable, is that this animal never fully disappears. We grow up, learn manners, lose baby teeth, gain responsibilities, but the id remains, as alive as when we cried in the cradle demanding sustenance. It does not age, does not mature, and never tires. On the contrary, it remains eternal in its biological simplicity. It wants pleasure, it wants relief, it wants satisfaction. If it could govern alone, we would be creatures driven by incessant impulses, incapable of differentiating desire from action. To understand the id in its pure state, one only needs to observe a small child or an adult facing a sufficiently strong temptation. The impulse to devour the candy before dinner, to respond to a provocation with brutal sincerity, to buy something expensive without considering the consequences, to send a message that should only remain in the imagination, all of this is the id whispering, sometimes shouting. It knows no limits because it does not recognize the existence of limits. The only language it speaks is the language of desire, immediate, irrefutable, and profoundly human. The most curious thing is that many believe that over time they have tamed their own id. I see men and women who are proud of their discipline, their self-control, their civilized demeanor. They convince themselves that they no longer possess childish impulses, forbidden desires, or inconvenient fantasies. They are mistaken. The id never disappears. It only learns to work behind the scenes. It becomes more creative, more symbolic, more disguised. It is the id that appears in the strangest dreams, in the slips we let out unintentionally, lapsus, in the overly bold jokes, in the thoughts that arise and that we quickly push back into the basement of the mind. The id is invisible, but not inactive. If the id had a motto, it would be something like, "Reality is a detail." It is not interested in circumstances, does not recognize consequences, and does not respect agreements. For this primitive part of the mind, the external world is little more than an inconvenient obstacle between it and what it desires. That is why the id often behaves like a petulant child or an absolutist king. It demands, commands, insists. And when repressed, it does not become weaker, just more ingenious. Repression does not destroy the id. It merely pushes it into forms of indirect expression that infiltrate daily life in ways we never openly confess. The truth is that we coexist with this hungry monster all the time. It accompanies us to work, to parties, to family gatherings. It is there when we feign patience, when we smile politely, when we say, everything is fine. But inside, we want to punch a wall. The civilized world demands that we put a leash on the id, but the id does not accept leashes. It merely waits for the moment to pull hard enough for it to break. That is why, in moments of stress, fatigue, or intense passion, we see the most primitive side emerge with impressive speed. The id is patient, but never harmless. However, we must not demonize it. Without the id, there would be no creativity, ambition, eroticism, enthusiasm, or vital impulse. It is the primary source of psychic energy, and like any powerful source, it can create or destroy. It is the inner fire that compels us to love, to fight, to seek, to dream. Civilization demands that the id be controlled, but life demands that it exist. The issue has never been to eliminate it, but rather to learn to live with this inner animal without being devoured by it. The id, when understood, can be an admirable force. When ignored, it becomes chaos. Therefore, I state without hesitation, the id is the most honest part of the human being. It does not pretend, does not disguise itself, does not negotiate. It simply shows who we are before we use masks, before we learn pretty words, before we worry about judgment. It is the beginning of everything, of pleasure, fear, passion, and even the conflicts that define us. In studying the id, we study the core of the human soul, in its purest and most dangerous form, and only when we acknowledge this hungry monster within us do we truly begin to comprehend the depth of the human mind. If the id is the hungry animal within us, and the superego is the severe finger-pointing moralist, then the ego, is the poor fellow in charge of keeping the house from falling down. I have always been amused to think of it as an overworked employee, constantly patching up the mental structure so that it doesn't collapse under the pressure of impulses, rules, and external demands. Imagine a stressed manager surrounded by two tyrannical bosses and a world outside that insists on presenting problems. That's it. The ego is the only one trying to maintain sanity while all the other departments demand the impossible. The ego was born from reality, not by choice, but by survival. It emerges when the baby realizes they cannot simply cry and receive everything immediately. Frustration generates thought. The obstacle creates the ego. And thus, for the first time, the world imposes a limit on the id. The child who wants milk now learns that sometimes they have to wait. This waiting, this negotiation between desire and possibility is the cradle of the ego. It learns early that life is not interested in what we want, but in what we can actually have. And from then on, it spends its entire life performing this exhaustive mediation. The ego's function is to try to reconcile what the id wants, what the superego demands, and what reality permits. A mission, I must say, completely impossible to achieve without stress. It is as if the ego were forced to negotiate with an insufferable brat, the id, a rigid moralizing schoolmaster, the superego, and an external world that frankly cares about neither of them. When you feel divided, overwhelmed, or in conflict with yourself, know this: it is the ego working overtime, trying to please everyone and succeeding in pleasing no one. The ego is creative because it has to be. It invents excuses, justifications, adaptations, rationalizations, all to prevent the id from messing up and the superego from punishing it cruelly. It creates defense mechanisms like someone building walls, doors, curtains, and alarms to prevent constant invasions. Repression, denial, projection, rationalization, these are not failures, but survival strategies of this exhausted manager. The ego fights daily to prevent the person from going insane, and I must admit, it does a rather reasonable job, considering the internal mess it has to manage. But the ego is not just a tired manager, it is also the narrator of our internal story. It tries to organize our experiences into a coherent narrative, even when there is no coherence at all. It takes contradictory impulses, disconnected emotions, and distorted memories and attempts to create something that makes sense. And that is how we construct our identity. A continuous act of organization and interpretation performed by a psychological administrator who works 24 hours a day, without vacation, without time off, without bonus, and with no prospect of retirement. The irony, however, is that this silent hero is the one most criticized. When we fail, we say we lost control. When we act impulsively, we say the ego was not strong enough. When we feel guilt, we say the ego didn't know how to deal with the superego. Few recognize that it is merely trying to survive in a completely hostile internal environment. The ego tries, with all its strength, to prevent the extremes from dominating, but rarely gets credit for the delicate balance it maintains. That is why many of our daily conflicts are due to the ego trying to please irreconcilable forces. It would like to rest, but it cannot. It would like to make simple decisions, but it never succeeds. It would like to live without guilt and without repression, but that is impossible. And thus, we live tired, not because modern life is complex, but because our mind is an endless internal debate. It is no wonder that so many people seek relief. The ego is like an employee who, in addition to their work, still has to deal with clients, bosses, crises, and daily fires. Therefore, when you feel overwhelmed, divided, or exhausted, remember, it is not weakness, it is the human condition. The ego is the bridge between what we want, what we should do, and what we can do. It is the one that keeps us standing while two opposing forces try to pull us in opposite directions. Without it, we would be slaves to desire or prisoners of guilt. With it, we at least have a chance to live, to choose, and to try to find a balance, even if imperfect. The ego is, after all, the true tired hero of our psyche. I need to tell you about one of the most troublesome, yet at the same time most fundamental entities that inhabit the human psyche. I am referring to the superego, that moralistic voice we all carry, even if we never invited it. It emerges silently throughout childhood as we absorb rules, prohibitions, commands, and expectations from parents, teachers, religions, authorities, and even the small scoldings we receive without quite understanding why. All of this accumulates within us, and one day, without warning, this voice awakens. From that point on, it never leaves us in peace. I observe it as a kind of internal judge. It watches every gesture, every intention, every thought, even those you swear no one will ever discover. The superego is tireless. It does not sleep, does not lose focus, and does not get distracted. It is an internal authority with standards so high that often not even a saint could achieve them. I always say that if the id is impulsive like a hungry beast, and the ego is the poor fellow trying to fix everything, then the superego is the severe inspector who appears in your mind just to point out mistakes and issue emotional fines. And perhaps you have already noticed how it operates in daily life. When you finally decide to rest after an exhausting day, the superego whispers in your ear, "Resting? Was that the best you could have done today?" When you decide to give yourself a small pleasure, like eating a piece of candy, it appears again, "Interesting choice, especially after your promise to avoid sugar." And even when you do everything right, absolutely everything, it still finds something to criticize. Yes, that's fine, but it could have been better. I observe that this voice has an extraordinary ability to turn any action into guilt. And the most intriguing thing is that the superego is not content with punishing concrete actions. It punishes even intentions. You can feel remorse for something you haven't even done because deep down, the superego is convinced that you could have done it. It does not need proof. The mere possibility is enough. That is why so many people feel guilt even when they have done nothing wrong. The superego deals with what I call sin by thought. But I must clarify, despite seeming like the internal enemy, it is not entirely malevolent. Without it, we would live as the id desires, without limits, without consideration, without civilization. It is the superego that reminds us of the rules that keep society functioning. It is necessary for us to be beings capable of living in a community. However, when it exaggerates, and it loves to exaggerate, it transforms prudence into rigidity, responsibility into self-censorship, and ethics into destructive perfectionism. That is why so many people come to me saying they cannot rest, or that they live with the feeling that they never do enough. It is not reality that demands so much of them, it is the superego. This internal authority is much harsher than any external authority has ever been. And when it becomes too dominant, the human being lives at war with themselves. I conclude then that the superego is the moralistic judge inside my head, and yours too, always ready to condemn, rarely willing to absolve, and almost never satisfied. Between the id that demands, the ego that negotiates, and the superego that criticizes, we become this battlefield called the self. Now that I have presented to you the three instances that inhabit the human mind, the hungry id, the exhausted ego, and the moralistic superego, I must reveal something even more unsettling. They do not coexist in harmony. On the contrary, they live as three forces in constant clash, each pulling the individual in a different direction. And this is precisely why, even when we believe we are fine, we feel a strange internal tension. It is not a lack of strength. It is not a failure of character. It is simply the human condition. I, as an observer of the soul, witness this invisible battle daily. The id screams for pleasure, urgency, immediate satisfaction. It wants everything now: food, rest, affection, freedom. It wants without asking, without weighing consequences. The superego, in turn, reacts like an irritated general. It forbids, criticizes, demands perfection, imposes rigid rules. It points the finger, delivers sermons, and reminds us of everything we cannot, should not, and do not deserve. And the ego, always the ego, is caught in the middle, trying to negotiate with these two powers like a desperate diplomat attempting to prevent a world war inside one's own mind. And I confess to you, it is not an easy job. The ego tries to appease the superego with discipline, attempts to soothe the id with small doses of permissible pleasure, and still has to deal with reality, which is rude, unpredictable, and rarely collaborates with our deepest desires. The result is that we live in a constant state of conflict, like a rope stretched to the maximum. That is why we are tired, not only physically but psychologically. It is not the world that wears us down. It is ourselves, dueling within. I perceive that this internal division creates curious contradictions. We are capable of intensely desiring something and at the same time feeling guilt for desiring it. We can love someone and simultaneously fear losing that love. We can want to rest and yet feel the obligation to work more. We are beings who always walk between two extremes: pleasure and morals, impulse and duty, desire and fear. When you feel your soul is torn into pieces, remember, it is not broken. It is like this by nature. But it is here that the great relief that I, Sigmund Freud, can offer you resides. There is no cure for this battle, because it is not a disease. It is what makes us human. Internal conflict is not a defect to be eliminated. It is an eternal movement, a constant dialogue that shapes our personal history. Without the tension between these forces, there would be no humanity, creativity, imagination, or even consciousness. And when I observe all of this more poetically, I realize that each of us is a small inner opera. Within us, three voices sing, fight, contradict each other, and sometimes harmonize for brief moments of peace. We are not a simple, linear, unified self. We are a disputing trio, a psychological concert that never ends, but from which we can learn to be better listeners. Understanding this conflict, this friction between the id, ego, and superego is the first step toward understanding the soul itself. For by seeing the forces that move us within, we cease to be victims of them and begin to be conscious interpreters of our own existence.